Italy has produced some of the greatest champions of all times. Today I want to take a look at one fighter who I most admire. He's ranked number 9, along with Benny Leonard and Tony Canzoneri. But speaking of Tony Canzoneri, he was born November 6, 1908 in Slendale, Louisiana. He died December 9, 1959 in New York. He stood 5 foot 4 inches and he weighed 117 to 143 pounds. Now, he was managed by Sammy Goldman. He had 137 wins, 24 losses, 10 draws, and 44 knockouts. He was a 5-time champion, 3 weight division title holder, featherweight, lightweight, and junior welterweight champion. In 1927, at the age of 19, he fought Bud Taylor to a draw for the bantamweight championship of the world. Tony Canzoneri also faced a fighter in 1928 and won the featherweight championship of the world. That fighter's name was Benny Bass. 1930, he would knock out Al Singer in one astonishing round to win a lightweight championship of the world. But in 1931, he would win a junior welterweight champion by defeating Jackie Kid Bird. He was a 5-time champion and 3 weight division title holder. He would fight fighters such as Battling Shaw, Bushy Graham, Andre Ratus, Billy Patrol, Barney Ross, Sammy Fuller, Wesley Ramsey, Frankie Click, Cecil Payne, Pete Nebo, Baby Arizmenzi, Lou Ambers, Midget Mexico, Jimmy McLaurin, Eddie Zivick, Al Bummy Davis, Kid Chocolate, just to name a few. Phenomenal fighter was Tony Canzoneri. Now to your left, you have Primo Carnera. He was born October 26, 1906 in Squales, Italy. Now he would die June 29, 1967 in Squales, Italy. He stood 6 foot 5 inches and weighed 138 to 184 pounds. He fought fighters such as Tommy Loughlin, who was a light heavyweight champion. Young Stribling. Unfortunately for young Stribling, he would die in a motorcycle crash accident. But he was a phenomenal fighter. As a matter of fact, he was Max Melling's first title defense when he would win the heavyweight championship of the world. And he would knock him out in the last round. Pierre Charles, Jose Santa, George Godfrey. George Godfrey was the colored heavyweight champion. Paulino Escadon, George Cook, Neil Gillespie, Jack Sharkey. Trying to think of these guys at the top of my head. Jack Sharkey knocked out Max Smelling, and I hit him with a low blow. But he was knocked out himself by Primo Carnera in the 6th round, and Primo Carnera had become the heavyweight champion of the world. He would also face a fighter by the name of Victorio Campolo, Max Baer, Joe Louis. Phenomenal fighter was Primo Carnera, although ran by the mob. But he was a specimen unlike any other in the heavyweight division. Featherweight champion Willie Pep was another phenomenal fighter from Hartford, Connecticut. He was born September 19, 1922, Hartford, Connecticut. He died November 23rd, 2006. I met Willie Pep. Willie Pep was some humanitarian. He had a personality on him, and he was a hell of a fighter, was Willie Pep, one of the greatest defensive wizards of all times. But he was a 5 foot 5 inches. He weighed 123 to 135 pounds, I believe he was. He had 230 wins, 11 losses, 1 draw, 65 knockouts. He became champion in 1942. But in 1943, he would lose his first fight to Sammy Angot. And that was his 63rd professional fight. And he was on a 62-fight win in 136 fights, I believe it was, before he lost his second fight to Sandy Saller. Sandy Saller, his first name was Joe. He was an outstanding champion, and he retired undefeated. Unfortunately for Sandy Saller, due to an eye injury, he had to retire. But he was some fighter, had one of the highest knockout ratios outside of Archie Moore. But as to Willie Pep was some fighter. He really was. He was in the ring with fighters such as Phil Terranova and Jackie Wilson, Patty DeMarco, Chalky Wright, who he took the featherweight championship title from. But Willie Pep was a hell of a fighter. And he's to your right. And to your left, you have Rocky Marciano, known as the Brockton Blockbuster. He would win the heavyweight championship belt in 1952 by knocking out Jersey Joe Walcott. And he would have his last fight in 1955 when he defeated Archie Moore in 9 rounds. He would hang up the glove in 1956. But the saddest moment for me with Rocky Marciano was when he knocked out Joe Louis in the 8th round in Madison Square Garden. He retired him. And Joe Louis was an idol of mine. He was a 12-year champion. He had 25 title defenses, and Rocky Marciano would knock him out in the 8th round. Rocky Marciano was a hell of a heavyweight, and he was an Italian heavyweight. So these are some great Italian fighters. Rocky Graziano was from New York, and he would win the middleweight championship belt by knocking out Tony Zale in the 7th round. Knocked him out in the 6th round in 1947. And what was amazing about Rocky Graziano, he didn't have the fighting experience that most fighters had. He was from the street. He went to prison, and he ran out of prison, and he wound up joining the army. And he joined the army so that he didn't have to go to prison. He had a choice by the judge. And as soon as he got out of the army, he was arrested and went back to jail, had to serve the remainder of his time. And after he did that, he wound up becoming a champion. He pulled down a microphone and said, "Ma, somebody up there likes me. And your boy did it." And Rocky Graziano was one of the hardest right-hand punchers of all times. My dad told me a lot of stories about him because he was very good friends with Rocky Graziano. Rocky Graziano was in a ring with fighters such as Charlie Fusari, Al Bummy Davis, Gene Burden. As a matter of fact, he was on a 20-fight winning streak when he knocked out Gene Burden, and I got him an opportunity to face Sugar Ray Robinson. He was also fighting Harold Green. Harold Green was from Bronzeville, Brooklyn, and he had a lot of street fights with Harold Green because Harold Green and him went to the same school, and they didn't get along. But he had wars with Harold Green as well. He was in the ring with Sonny Horn and Marty Servo and Freddie Redcock Crane, Bernie Miller, Gene Burden, Tony Gennaro. As a matter of fact, with the Tony Gennaro fight, that fight is what also got him an opportunity to face Sugar Ray Robinson because he was losing the fight. And it was in the last few seconds of that last round. And if he didn't knock him out, he would have lost the fight and never got that opportunity for the middleweight championship crack. But Rocky Graziano was born June 7th, 1922 in New York, and he died May 22nd, 1990. Like I said, I had the pleasure of meeting Rocky Graziano. I met him several times. Stand-up guy was Rocky Graziano. He's to your right. To your left is the Bronx Bull, Jake LaMotta. Jake LaMotta was born June 10th, 1921 in the Bronx, New York. He was some specimen, a hell of a fighter. He was short for his weight, but he had 2 arms that can sling like dynamite. I remember him winning the Diamond Gloves in 1939. And when he turned professional, it's crazy because he was a light heavyweight champion in the Diamond Gloves in 1939. Ray Robinson was a featherweight champion in 1939 when he won the New York Golden Gloves. So that was amazing. And these two men would face each other in 1942, 1943. In 1951 was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And that's when Jake LaMotta would lose his middleweight championship in 1951 in the 13th round by Ray Robinson. But he would be in the ring with Bob Satterfield and Holman Williams and Robert Villamain, Fritzy Zivit, Tiberio Mitri, Tommy Bell. Just trying to think of these guys. Lloyd Marshall, he was in the ring with Burt Littell, O'Neill Bell, Irish Bob Murphy, Danny Nordico. As a matter of fact, Danny Nordico is the only fighter that would actually drop Jake LaMotta. He's never been on the canvas before in his life, and that was his first time. Danny Nordico was a light heavyweight, and Jake LaMotta was a middleweight, moving up to light heavyweight. Danny Nordico had a war with a fighter by the name of Charlie Norcus, who was actually a heavyweight. They had a 2-fight series, one of the great fight series in the history of boxing, in my opinion. But this is Jake LaMotta, who's another Italian. So I'm just giving you my point of view on Italian fighters. They had some great champions. But the man I want to talk about today is the Scotch Wop, Johnny Dundee, who's to your left. Now, Johnny Dundee was some fighter. He was born November 22nd, 1893 in Sicily, Italy. He died April 22nd, 1965. He was only 71 years of age at the time of his death. He was raised in the Lower East Side of New York. But he unfortunately passed away in East Orange, New Jersey. He stood 5'4" He was an orthodox boxer. He had a 63-inch reach. Now, he was managed by 2 different managers. One was Scotty Motis, 1910 and 1920, and he was also managed by James J. Johnson, 1920 to 1929. James J. Johnson, he had ran Madison Square Garden. As a matter of fact, Joe Louis was trying to go with Jimmy Johnson, is what they actually called him. But he wound up going with Mike Jacobs because he was trying to get a title shot. And Jimmy Johnson couldn't guarantee him a title shot, but he could guarantee him fights at Madison Square Garden. But Johnny Dundee was some fighter. He fought a fighter by the name of Joe Willing in the first main event card under the Walker Law in 1920. Now, the Walker Law was named after a sponsor. He was a senator by the name of James J. Walker. And the first positive boxing legislation came from that. James J. Walker, from that senator. It was passed. The vote was passed in 3019, March 25th, 1920, and they actually took the rules from the American Expeditionary Forces, which is the ABF, and that was very heavily influenced to get that bill passed, because the ABF was a military type of boxing organization. And you had guys such as Gene Tunney, who wound up becoming America's light heavyweight champion and the world heavyweight champion. And you also had another fighter by the name of Bob Martin. He was a heavyweight champion in the ABF. But then in the lightweight champion, you had a fighter, Leo Johnson. Now, Johnny Dundee fought from 1910 to 1932. He fought in the lightweight championship division. He fought the Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard, 9 times. Benny Leonard was some fighter. I have him ranked number 1, along with Joe Gans as the greatest lightweight champion of all time. I have him ranked number 1 collectively with Joe Gans. I'm still trying to decide who's actually the better fighter, but at this moment, I have him collectively ranked number 1 as the greatest lightweight champion of all times with Joe Gans. And he was born April 6, 1896 in New York. He died April 18th, 1947 in New York. He was wrestling a match in St. Nicholas Arena, and he wound up having a heart attack, and he died and collapsed in the ring, fortunately for him. But he was a phenomenal fighter, was the Ghetto Wizard, Benny Leonard. He weighed 123 to 153 pounds. He stood 5 foot 5 inches. Now, the thing with Benny Leonard, he made a comeback after he retired. He had a very good investment in stocks. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, his money went with it. So he was forced to make a comeback. And when he made a comeback, he had to move up to the welterweight division. He was originally a lightweight. And he moved up to the welterweight division. And he had a couple of tune-up fights, if you will. And he wound up fighting Jimmy McLaurin. Jimmy McLaurin was an outstanding fighter from Vancouver. And he wound up becoming a welterweight champion when he defeated Young Corbett III. He was in a war with Barney Ross, was Jimmy McLaurin. But Jimmy McLaurin will wind up stopping Benny Leonard. It was a sad night in New York, and that was some fight between Benny Leonard and Jimmy McLaurin. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background with Benny Leonard. He was some fighter. He fought fighters such as Joe Young Shug, Tommy Hawk. Tommy Hawk was a very good fighter. Philadelphia's Pal Moore. Pal Moore was a dynamite puncher with either hand. He fought Johnny Kilbane, Rocky Kansas, Freddie Welch. I mean, just to name a few of these fighters. Believable, unbelievable was fighter, the Ghetto Wizard, Jimmy McLaurin, and the fight with Benny Leonard. Now, when Lou Tendler had faced Benny Leonard, Lou Tendler from Philadelphia was a southpaw. He was one of the greatest southpaws of all times. Phenomenal fighter was Lou Tendler. And Jim McLaurin would be in the ring with Lou Tendler as well and sparring, and he said that Lou Tendler can crack. But Benny Leonard would also be in the ring with Charlie White. Now, Charlie White was from Chicago, and he was a puncher. And when he was in the ring with Benny Leonard, that was some fight. Benny Leonard fought basically everybody in his time, and like I said, I have him rated number 1 as the greatest lightweight, along with Joe Gans, in the history of the game. Now, Johnny Dundee would face lightweight champions Willie Ritchie and Freddie Welch. Johnny Dundee fought over 330 bouts. He would have 194 wins, 22 knockouts, 60 losses, and 41 draws. He would have 117 no decisions, and he'd be stopped twice. In his 87th bout, Dundee fought Johnny Kilbane. Johnny Kilbane was some fighter as well. He had great fights with Benny Leonard and among others. But Johnny Kilbane would fight Johnny Dundee to a draw. In the next 2 title shots in 1921, Johnny Dundee would have 264 fights before he would win on a disqualification against George K.O. Cheney in the 5th round. Dundee became the first recognized world champion in the junior welterweight division in boxing history. In 1923, he became the world featherweight champion in defeat of Eugene Creek of France. May 30th, 1923, Dundee lost his World Junior Lightweight Championship belt to Jewish star Jack Bernstein at the Vanderdome in New York. It was a 15-round disappointment for Johnny Dundee. December 17th, 1923, 15 rounds, December. He would face an unbelievable fight in front of a crowd of 13,589 spectators. He would have a rematch with the unbelievable Jack Bernstein. This was in New York's Madison Square Garden. Now, the thing with Johnny Dundee, he never defended his featherweight championship belt that he would win from Eugene Creek in 1923. You see, you have to remember that Dundee would withdraw from fighting and defending his title that he would win from Kid Kaplan. And, he just decided he didn't want to defend that title, so they took it away from him. And that belt went from fighter to fighter to fighter and eventually fell into the hands of Philadelphia's Benny Bass. And Benny Bass was recognized by the NBA, the National Boxing Association, as champion. And it was not debunked by the New York SAC, which is the New York State Athletic Commission. They didn't protest the decision, so therefore Benny Bass was considered the champion. Now, after Johnny Dundee would lose to three-division champion Tony Canzanieri, October 27th, Johnny Dundee beat Willie Ritchie, who was the former lightweight champion of the world at Madison Square Garden. Willie Ritchie was a Californian who clipped Dundee to the jaw, placing him against the ropes. And Johnny Dundee would do his famous Scotch Wop dance. And what that was is he would lean against the ropes. Now, he was one of the greatest rope fighters of all times because he would put his butt on the middle strand of the rope. He would take his right foot and place it outside of the rope, hooking the bottom strand of the rope. And he would have his neck bouncing on the top strand of the rope. And he had a rhythm to him, where he would know how to move in time and move around and bang his fighter to the body, to the head, pop off the ropes, come up with combinations, and spin out. He was a master at that. And that's what they called him, the Scotch Wop. They called him the Wop because he was Italian and he did a Scotch dance when he was on the ropes. Phenomenal fighter was Johnny Dundee.